Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are really excited to be here with all of you from across the country and around the world to celebrate this very important book, Practicing Liberation, Transformative Strategies for Collective Healing and Systems Change, Reflections on Burnout, Trauma, and Building Communities of Care in Social Justice Work. We have an incredible lineup of folks with us here tonight. The two editors, Tessa, Hicks, Peterson, and Hala, Khouri, are here. They are joined by some great contributors. So Keely Nguyen, Nkem Ndefo, Jacoby Ballard, Leslie Booker, goes by Booker, are all here. And we also are joined by two incredible interpreters. Wait, did I say Nkem as well? Nkem Ndefo, my bad. I'm reading off too many things at once. So we are here with Nat Skinner, who is our first interpreter, as well as Erica Lipscomb-Capwell. So they're going to be trading off tonight. So keep your eyes on them. We are just really happy to have so many practitioners of various kinds of justice work in the house. In the chat, we encourage you, as you are already doing, to shout out where you're watching from. We want this to be a warm and supportive chat. So make some virtual noise, some emoji noise, whatever feels right to you. You also may ask questions at any time. There is an ask question icon on your far right. Looks like a little joker icon. Click on that and ask questions. If that is somehow inaccessible to you or you're just having trouble finding it, you can put them in the chat and I'll move them over to the Q&A box so that our folks can find them and bring your questions into the room. So I am just going to shout out, really, I'm not going to read everyone's full bio, but I will be dropping the bios into the chat so that you can read them, because I do want you to know who is in the room and all of their important work. But I will just begin by introducing Hala Khouri, who's going to start us off. Hala has been teaching yoga and movement for over 25 years and has been clinical work and trainings for 15 years. She co-founded Off the Mat into the World, a training organization to bridge yoga and activism within a social justice framework. She leads collective resilience, trauma-informed yoga, and somatics trainings nationally. So welcome, Hala. We're so glad you're here. And welcome to you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. And I'm really loving, as you all chat, we get to see your names. So it's a way to really have a sense of who's here. I'm just going to take us through a quick grounding and then I'll pass the mic to Tessa. This is something that we invite folks to do in the book, that anytime we gather together, taking a moment to connect to our breath, to the earth beneath us, to each other, helps to create a space that can feel more meaningful, more embodied, and more relational. So even though we're virtual, even though we don't see everybody here, we can still create that connection. So I'm going to invite you to start by connecting to yourself. So checking in with your own body, your own soma. You might look for a place of grounding, a place where you feel support in your body. It might be your bum in your chair or your feet on the floor. There might be an image that grounds you. So just take a moment to feel into the quality of your own presence right now. Maybe you're carrying things in your body that feel heavy, that feel difficult. Maybe you're feeling light and spacious, or everything in between. Allow yourself to arrive exactly as you are. And if you want, you might try putting one hand on your heart and one hand on your solar plexus. And just notice if this might be settling or containing for you right now. Feeling your own breath, your own internal rhythm. And then feeling in your own awareness the rest of the folks on this call. So you might be seeing some of us presenters on your screen, noticing the names of folks in the chat. So feeling for the community that has gathered here right now. You might even imagine us sitting in a circle together in a space that feels nourishing for you. And feeling into the power of community, the power of being together in this way. And then feeling into this land that you are on. All of us, we're all around the country. So feeling the earth, the land, the history of the place you're in, the complexity of that. And simply allow your breath to move through you in whatever way it wants. As we ground here together, as we land here together, to try to build a space that is liberatory, opening up this space together. We'll take one more deep breath together. And I'm going to pass the mic to Tessa.
Thank you so much, Hala. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. It's just such a pleasure and honor to be here together. I am going to share a little context about the gestation and birthing of this book, the impetus and the process. So I personally have been doing work in community organizations and schools, looking at issues of social justice and fights for justice and liberation for 33 years. And in my time doing so, I have really noticed that myself and a lot of fellow comrades in the work suffer from the challenges of this work, the pain, the suffering, the violence, the injustice, the grief and trauma. And there's not always a lot of space to hold that, process it, repair from it, heal it, and move towards our joy and our rest and our creativity and our connection and community care. And I know this has been real for many others as well. And I came to Hala, my best friend and collaborator of over 20 years, 25 years, and said, let's do something to really tap into if other folks are wanting to explore this together. How do we not replicate the urgency and hyper productivity and hyper individualism and intensity of the dominant systems we're a part of, while we're actually trying to disrupt them and do something different? How do we get out of our own way and do and be in the work for social justice in a different way and embody liberation and practice it each day as we are actually trying to create the world we want? And so we brought together community organizers and small grassroots organizations and large nonprofits and people involved in all kinds of issues of social justice. And we started, this is 4.5 years ago, with a workshop called The Traumas of Injustice with community-based organizations out of the inland region of Southern California. And we really talk to folks about what they see in their work and what causes more stress and trauma and pain and suffering, and in the ways in which we're doing the work and what we're coming up against, and what are the places where we feel release from stress and the joint feeling of love and care and belonging and creativity and liberation. And from that experience, we got a lot of folks telling us what they wanted and needed and thought, and what practices they pull on, and the inheritance of cultural traditions that help them make their way through all of this. And we began to really think about how could we expand the work to address the needs that people were expressing they had. And we created an 8-month-long training program and had learned a lot. We did interviews and focus groups and healing circles and listening circles with folks about what folks who are executive directors and leaders in this area and grassroots organizers and healing practitioners and teachers. And we learned and provided a lot of ideas and workshops and trainings with them over the course of a year. And everyone said, this is great, but we want more. We would like something tangible to hold on to, where we can have practices that we can do each day, where we can read and learn about alternative ways that we can do this work that are trauma informed and healing centered and full of community care as we're doing the good fight. And so I asked some of my most beloved collaborators some new and some very, very well known to me for years, if they would do this with me. And every single one said yes. I was very grateful when they responded so affirmatively to the idea. And then we put it out to some publishers and they said yes. And thus was born the book. Not without a lack of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of writing, rewriting, revising, editing, designing, wrestling, dreaming. And I want to say something about that process very briefly, which is that we really try to embody in the process as much as we could the values that we're trying to write about and live, which is how do we connect with each other? How do we wrestle with these ideas? How do we navigate conflict in generative ways? How do we talk together as we're trying to formulate ideas and practice them in real time? So we have this book full of strategies and frameworks and reflections and narratives about how we work at these intersections of healing and justice. And then next week, we'll have an accompanying workbook come out that Keely will talk about more later, that is hitting the shelves in 1 week with actual practices individuals and organizations can do. So that's a bit of the context, the impetus, the framing for the work. And I appreciate so much that we get to celebrate this beautiful work with all the community members and elders and teachers and students that have helped us figure out what we want to say in this book, and hopefully it's meaningful and useful to all. And I'm going to pass the mic back to Hala for her to share a little bit more about her chapter on traumas of injustice, and then we'll continue passing the mic to hear about the author's experience as well as hear some excerpts from the book itself. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tessa. So I'm going to just take a moment and just read the introductory passage of the chapter that I wrote, which is called The Traumas of Injustice. A lot of my work has really been at the intersection of mental health and activism, and working inside of organizations to support them to build cultures that are really representative of their values. And so I'll just read this, and then I'm going to pass it off to Nkem after this, who's going to, take this and unpack it and talk more about it in her own magical, skillful ways. I start by quoting Kazuhaga, who wrote the foreword to the book, and he says here, "We can bring down the entire system and have a worldwide revolution. But if we haven't healed our traumas and learned how to be in authentic relationships with each other, we will corrupt any new system we put into its place." So I go on to say, why do we need to be trauma informed? The most deleterious impact of the trauma of injustice is the loss of the ability to imagine and enact justice. As Kazuhaga said, even if we succeed in dismantling systems of oppression, we will inevitably recreate them if we have not attended to and healed our own collective trauma. Grounding ourselves in a trauma-informed framework can support a culture of healing in our organizations and collaborations. Justice cannot happen without healing, and trauma, as well as toxic stress, can get in the way of this process. A trauma-informed framework is not meant to pathologize trauma-impacted communities and individuals. Rather, it can shed light on the ways that unaddressed trauma can get in the way of healing and can even contribute to the re-traumatization of people within our own movements. A paradigm of healing justice invites us to envision how our organizations might become a reflection of what we hope to see in the world. It's an invitation for us to practice justice and liberation together in an embodied and relational way. One last piece here. At the heart of a trauma-informed approach is the call to center healing, personally, interpersonally, and collectively. Inside our movements for justice, the impact of systemic oppression and injustice can keep us in survival mode, constantly putting out fires and fighting for basic rights. This can make it feel impossible to have space to imagine what we want because all our energy is focused on dealing with the impacts of what we don't want. This is one of the aspects of the trauma of injustice. It can block our capacity to dream and to imagine. And when we center healing in our work towards justice, it can challenge and disrupt the ways we've become so accustomed to fighting that we get stuck and even unconsciously attached to the fight. So I've seen this happen in a lot of my work, going into organizations, and folks are so tired and so exhausted. And I often like to talk about the ways that these larger systems live inside our own nervous systems, and they live between us and amongst us. And so those of us that want to see a change in the world, we have an opportunity to try to build that with each other so that we can continue to try to change the world so we can be sustainable together and so we can shift our own individual nervous systems. This is not about putting the burden on the individual, understanding that the systems are broken. This is also about understanding the connection between our individual nervous system and our collective nervous system and these larger systems that are unfortunately not designed to let us be well. So I'm going to pause here and pass the mic to Nkem, who's really centered in this work in such an incredible way. Nkem Ndefo. You're muted. Bottom right.
Yeah. I got it. It just needed to click twice. The perennial issue of being online. Thank you, Hala, so much for just landing it right into where I'd like to start. So a lot of the work that I do is deep in the United States, but also internationally in organizations of all different sizes, from small community-based organizations to large bureaucratic healthcare systems. And I write about embedding what I've come to call an embodied, trauma-informed, and resilience-oriented, or ETRO approach in systems, and noting the intersection of where the individual sits in the ecology and the interplay between the two. And so I'd like to read a little bit from my chapter, talking about some of the energies that we need to manage when we're doing change work. So we need a certain fight energy to dismantle the interlocking systems of oppression. Settler colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, ableism, ageism. Activists and change agents use this energy to identify and challenge the ways that oppressions manifest in our governments, our schools, our organizations, through codified hierarchies, statutes, and policies that mutually reinforce both informal procedures and processes, our relational dynamics, and cultural norms. Interrogation, critique, subversion of dominant narratives, structures, and ways of being require judgment and a focus on what is wrong. They require uprooting, tearing down, blowing up, smashing, protesting, defying, fighting. The spirit is urgent, confrontational, and destructive, and it is necessary to interrupt harm. And when we apply an embodied lens to this dismantling energy, it allows us to bring the learnings from neurophysiology and psychology of human defense responses. And we know that threat activates a cascade of internal changes marked by a flood of adrenaline. This leads us to feel a global experience of pressure, reactivity, and a need to mobilize rather than feeling present and connected. However useful this fight energy is for protection and a subversion of oppressive systems, it comes with its own dangers when employed in situations that either don't warrant a fight reaction or ask for a more nuanced response. Defense responses are built to hijack our whole beings in service of preserving life, livelihood, and self. Biologic urgency can collapse strategic thinking and create rigid binaries that impair access to flexible problem solving. The survival instinct narrows our concern to self-preservation at the expense of the larger collective, and in the extreme, it dehumanizes those different from us. It numbs both our internal experience and our shared humanity, which allows the control and domination inherent in the systems of oppression themselves to replicate inside us and inside our work, as Hala so beautifully said. And that this fight energy is very different than the spirit we need to reimagine liberatory worlds where we thrive. It is more than imagining, but rather, as my co-conspirators at Healing Justice London say, rehearsing freedoms. Being and relating to one another in ways that sustainably create equity, support interdependence, celebrate difference, nurture creativity, savor pleasure, and provide nourishing rest. Dreaming and building are spacious and generative processes in which we need to be able to hold multiple complexities and remain settled enough in our bodies to connect to our interiority without letting our perspectives and needs eclipse those of others. The biology of a settled nervous system supports the psychology and behaviors that afford easy social connection and communication. It creates space, time, and flexibility in thinking and actions. Rest becomes restorative, supporting energetic sustainability. Systems change requires the spirit of both the dismantling and the building. But we need the self-knowledge to determine whether we are in the dismantling or the building energy, the wisdom to discern when to engage which energy, and the skills to shift our states fluidly. So with that little bit, I talk about how embedding this approach in organizations with a little bit of a roadmap and an illustrative example from a piece of work that I did with some law enforcement, actually. So it was just a really exciting process to create this with these collaborators. We learned a lot. We had some writing retreat, and it was a beautiful synergy to learn about each other's work and to be less siloed, and really supported the rest of our writing process. And with that, I would love to invite Jacoby up to share a little bit about their piece that they have in the book.
Thank you so much, Nkem. In my piece, I got really interested in the kind of intersection between work that I was doing in Buddhist circles around forgiveness and external calls for accountability in social movement cultures, and see so much what those two practices can offer each other and kind of fill in gaps for each other. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be in this community and to write this chapter, because it's probably going to be the seed for my next book. So I'm just going to read a little piece, part of the piece about accountability, because it's so often floated around movement circles. The idea of holding someone accountable, an individual who has created harm within social justice movements, is an attempt to control someone else. We can invite someone into accountability, and in fact, most trusting, courageous, and intimate relationships across difference involve and even demand accountability. We can create boundaries in the interest of self-preservation if someone's words and actions do not change, but we only have control over ourselves. We cannot control someone else. When we don't have control over someone in our social justice community who makes a mistake, too often we rely on carceral methods of shame, isolation, and punishment. And we sometimes even enact greater obstacles for that person to meet their economic needs and continue in their livelihood. What is the impact of these tactics? Are we growing our movements? Are we building trust within our movements? I don't think employing these tactics allows us to build power, but is rather a projection of the pain that we feel from chronic systemic injustice that we project onto a single individual. We cannot make someone acknowledge their actions or its impact. We can't make this person feel remorse. We can't make someone make something right or transform. This is up to the individual. And clearly, I think this is in the best interest of an individual and for us to make collective progress toward healing and justice. I can provide feedback to someone. I can be vulnerable and share how thoughts, words, and actions impact me. But I can't make someone accountable to me if they don't want to be or are unwilling to be. When it's forced, there's a risk of a lack of genuineness, a lack of commitment, because it's being demanded rather than offered, and is only a one-way street. As Alicia Garza has suggested, we can mutually decide we're entering into an accountable relationship, but if there's not a previously existing relationship, then the accountability is forced. Being willing to be accountable ourselves is a different thing. We should seek that kind of responsibility and move toward it. We are asking others to assist us in our commitment to our values and to shed light where we might be unaware. We're listening to the feedback and the impact of our actions. We are in relationship. Danielle Sarad, from her restorative justice work with Common Justice, suggests, quote, accountability is active. I have to acknowledge what I did. I have to acknowledge its impact on others. I have to express genuine remorse. I have to make things as right as possible, ideally as defined by those harmed. And I have to become someone who will never cause that harm ever again. So then accountability is an offering that we can make toward justice, towards our relationships, towards our movements, but it can't be forced by someone else. Anna Brown says, the path to a future in which humans, Adrienne Marie Brown says, the path to a future in which humans can be in an authentic and accountable peace with each other is fractal. We must be willing to practice authenticity and accountability at the small scale of ourselves and our lives, within ourselves and within our immediate relationships. End quote. So when a politician says something harmful, who will lean in? When it's revealed that a movement leader isn't leading with integrity, can we move toward them? When our partners, our children, our comrades betray us, can we slow down and get curious? Each time conflict emerges, harm is enacted, or oppression is reproduced, we have an opportunity to heal, to practice authenticity and accountability. But it cannot be forced. I'm going to pass the baton to my dear, dear friend, Booker. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jacoby. It was really vulnerable for me to bring in the heart practices of the Brahmaviharas, these teachings of the Buddha. And we speak about metta, loving kindness, benevolence, compassion, mudita, joy for another person's happiness, and equanimity. This having this sense of a balanced mind and heart. It felt really vulnerable for me to bring this forth into this book. And I was so clear that this is my path. This is what has supported me in all the years that I spent working in jails, working with vulnerable populations. It was this path that allowed me to stay through my anger, through my rage. It gave me a place to land. And so I want to speak with you all a little bit about compassion and how it sort of started for me. I was 9 years old, the very first time that I saw folks experiencing homelessness. My family had been living in Japan for many years. And so when we came back to the US, I was driving in the backseat of my parents' yellow Volvo when I saw folks who were experiencing homelessness for the first time. And I remember my first thought was, so this is how the US takes care of our most vulnerable people. And I remember having this visceral feeling in my body, this quivering in my body, and this desire to move towards action. And I came to learn many years later, decades later, that what I felt in that moment was the embodied definition of compassion. When there's a quivering in the heart and the desire to move towards action. So often compassion gets conflated or mashed up with things that look, sound, might even feel similar. These are called the near enemy of compassion, like pity or empathy. And a good way to parse these apart is to imagine you've witnessed someone walking into a glass door, okay? So pity says, damn, that sucks, and kind of leans more towards the energy of having sorrow for this person. And it stops there. Empathy says, ouch, I know that had to hurt. But again, it stops there. What compassion does, however, is a two-part experience of first feeling the empathy and then moving us towards the action of wiping the blood off of the person's forehead. So like most things, compassion is not a monolith, meaning that not everyone's expression of compassion is the same. it moves and shifts and transforms into the kind of compassion that is the appropriate response for what is needed in that moment. So sometimes the appropriate response is turning inwards to first acknowledge and then create the space to honor and mourn what we have lost. And sometimes the appropriate response could be to hit the streets to reclaim our freedoms. Whatever our expression of compassion is, it is an act of love to pay attention to this energy of the heart, to turn towards it and to respond instead of ignoring or walking away from it. The writer Toni Morrison says, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it's important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom. And that is how civilizations heal." And so compassion is asking us to keep turning towards her, building up our resiliency and resistance to be with our own discomfort, to recognize our own pain, connecting with our own vulnerability. And in turn, we're able to recognize and feel that in others. Our really brilliant friend Teo Drake once said, "If you can move towards your discomfort, I can move away from my pain. So let's meet somewhere in the middle." So compassion does not condone bad behavior, which I think is a misconception. We're practicing compassion here. Instead, it allows me to see where a person got dropped along the way. And so instead of meeting people's violence with my violence, I pause to reflect on what could have made this kind of hatred manifest in another person's body, heart, and mind. And knowing that if I allow my hatred to match their hatred, then they have won. I've allowed them to poison, this poison to colonize my heart, to occupy space that I had reserved for caring for my community. Our beautiful ancestor Bell Hooks teaches, for me, compassion and forgiveness are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? Like most things in life, this practice of compassion can be misunderstood and weaponized to justify all kinds of naughty and destructive behavior. For example, a lot of us would benefit greatly from practicing self-compassion, giving ourselves the same kindness and care we give to a good friend. And yet some folks, typically folks who dive into the deep end of guilt and shame when they unintentionally perpetrate an oppression, can spiritually bypass over taking responsibility for their actions in order to practice this self-compassion. There is a yes and that needs to happen here. Yes, it does not serve any of us to cower in the presence of our ignorance. And let's not turn away from the beautiful opportunity to be in relationship with another, to learn something new, and to take this knowledge back to educate our communities. And to remember, dear ones, that we belong to each other. So thank you, and I'd like to turn this over to Keely.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to share that we have our workbook that's paired with it. I don't have a copy right now, so pretend my hand is there, that you can utilize the practices that all the contributors have created. And I feel like really grateful for the practices similar to the grounding one that Hala did, if you were interested in that. But there's more of like body tasks, body scans, breathing exercises, organizational and like community practices to do together. And I think about how like the workbook these past 4 years have like really aligned me with my body and mind together, in terms of how do I like integrate my values into the daily lives. And the work I do now, like as an activist and like organizer, is really challenging, and I feel really fortunate to be like aligned at an organization that carries like the workbook values in anthology too. And I really hope that you get it. It is next week. And there's just a lot of, like, for me, like, how do you deal with conflict that arises in the workplace? How do you deal with conflict in personal relationships too? And sometimes there's just a lot of trauma that occurs, but with like these practices really help buffer it. And as me as a participant too, and I feel like I've grown a lot, and I hope that we're able to share this community piece with you. Thank you. We can hop over to the Q&A session now.
All 88 of you, I hope you can get a sense of the book. And we really attempted to have diverse viewpoints and strategies and frameworks and practices that come at these topics from all different kinds of ways. And you'll see that through the different chapters. And hopefully you heard a little bit of that today. So we're going to take the journey that we've been on together so far and move it into some questions and answers. So there's a box to the right of your screen, the second little emblem down that has a question mark within that side of a box. So you should be able to add a Q&A question there. And we have one here for Nkem. So I'm going to dish this up for you, Nkem. The question is, if in your work with police, if you believe that changing individual cops and a power over system is set up to protect and enforce the ruling class.
And a short answer, no. This was a very interesting project. This was a project that was put together by a group of activists in support of street vendors in the Los Angeles area. And it was a process to both educate the enforcers, right? So here's the law enforcement who's enforcing the, basically, for better, broken window policing, right? Like, this is a mess, we're going to clean it up, and being very, very harsh to primarily immigrant, primarily monolingual Spanish, though some other Asian language speakers. And it was a way to educate them and also to work with them to hopefully tap some of their own compassion in an effort of harm reduction while there was efforts to make policy changes at a larger level. So it was part of a multi-pronged effort. And one thing that was very interesting in the work of working with the police in using an embodied trauma-informed approach is that the police really were, these law enforcement were really that these are other and we are us. And there was a very much of a separation. And as they started to embody, right, and recognize that they too were victims in a system, although that, I don't think we had enough time to work for them to come into a level of accountability of the harm they were causing. But the recognition that they had more in common with the people that they were enforcing than the people who were creating the laws in the first place was mind-blowing to them. And so baby steps. But my short answer to you, Lorraine, is no, I don't believe that working on the individual level will change the system. This was a harm reduction. Yeah, and part of a multi-pronged effort. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Nkem. That's a big topic to wrestle with in a short period of time. Beautiful answer. We have a question from Mel Cassidy. And this might be for Jacoby, but I think probably anyone could speak to it. I would love to hear more about how we can address harm and the people who are perpetrating harm within liberatory spaces when many of those spaces still lack space holding for accountability work.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a really important reflection that a lot of our spaces don't have that space, and a lot of us don't have the skills and the tools. But some of the skills and tools are pretty simple, like slowing down, getting curious rather than rushing to conclusions, to honor the multiple sides of any story. Tapping into Booker's compassion work, right? Hurt people hurt people. So if someone in movement is hurting people, they are also hurt. And so can we move towards them to address, the pain? Not all of us. There's another section in the chapter that I wrote in this book about even privileged people are not throwaway people, right? And that's why all of us are needed, right? It might be my work to move towards some of the white guys that are like perpetrating toxic masculinity in our movement spaces, but it might not be Booker's work. It might not be the work of other people here, right? Based on our positionality and how we experience trauma. So some of the tools I think we already have. We just need to like be really intentional about calling upon them, but slowing down and curiosity. As well as like thinking about like who is in deep relationship with the person who's causing harm, because that's the person and whose opinion that they care about the most, right? And that's one of the calls of kind of the tools of accountability work, is to leverage those relationships, because we're social creatures and none of us want to be left alone, left in the dust, especially by our beloved people. Right? Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Jacoby. That was beautiful. And there's another question that's similar to it. I don't know, Booker, if you want to take this on, whoever feels inspired, but similar to Mel's question, it seems many people who might be open to this work don't have the foundational skills to participate in accountability processes. How do we both in individual relationships and also broadly in our society try to bring people along with this process from where they're at, and also sort of change the water we swim in related to accountability skills?
I can begin with that, Tessa. Thanks. And, for me, a lot of the work, I worked with vulnerable populations for many years, as well as being on the front lines as an activist and getting really burnt out and exhausted. And I realized that what is so important is to establish the foundation of how we show up, how we want to show up. Oftentimes we want to change people, change the experience, change the dynamics. And when we go in saying, you do this, you do that, it's not really going to be that sustainable. So starting with having our own foundation, centered, clear, leading with compassion, leading with the way that we want the world to be instead of bullying us in towards it. I found that I moved into many spaces first, mouth first, and then I moved into spaces heart first, and it was a completely different experience. And so I highly recommend, my chapter, I'm speaking about the 4 Brahma Viharas, these 4 heart practices. Some of them are very fierce, but they start from a place of in here, of remembering that we belong to each other, that our intention is not to separate, it's not to isolate, it's not to pull away, but rather to come together, to be cohesive. And that is what I found meant to be really supportive in being able to move spaces forward. I think that's useful.
Thank you, Booker.
Tessa, I had something to add.
Please.
I think that a really big piece of creating foundation is this culture building piece, and that culture has to be explicit, and we have to keep reiterating it over and over and over again, right? So if you're trying to create a culture inside your organizations where folks are understanding our relationship to accountability, running towards accountability, to quote Mia Mingus, who has some beautiful writings on accountability, it's just got to be built into the culture, and that culture has to be reaffirmed, like every meeting, not every, but like when we're not reaffirming the culture, we're going to slide into dominant culture patterns, which is us and them. And so depending on the different contexts folks are in, I would invite people to think about, I love that idea of changing the water we swim in. So we can change the water maybe inside of our organizations and our collectives. And so what does it mean to articulate the culture, our relationship towards accountability, our relationship towards collective care, and do that every day, all the time, until it really becomes part of the waters, and then keep doing it. So that's the really important foundational work.
Thanks so much for adding that in, Hala. I'm going to add one quick thing in because it's a reference to our book, which is actually from the workbook, which is coming out next week. But a dear friend and collaborator who wrote the foreword for this book, Kazu Haga, has a piece in the workbook that's about explicit value systems. And really, like Hala was saying, recognizing the norms that we come in with from our dominant culture, and then what's the explicit value systems that we want to move towards as a foundation for how we're going to do the work together. And that activity in that workbook, I think, is really helpful, as well as the activity on generative conflict. How to make conflict generative is probably one of the hardest and most important practices, I think, of our time. So that there's some more practices in the workbook on that I would refer to folks to. I'm going to now just allow myself actually to speak to one of the next questions and then pass the mic to those who would like to also ask this. This is a question that is, what are some of y'all's sacred texts, meaning books that you go to when you need grounding and healing? And I just mentioned Kazu Haga. His book, Healing Resistance, has been a game changer for me personally around really living the philosophy and practices of nonviolent action from a Kenyan perspective. I would also say for myself, shout out to my mom, Stephanie Waxman, who gave me Being Peace from Thich Nhat Hanh when I was 9 years old. Still something I return to in a deep way for grounding. And of course, Adrienne Maree Brown, Bell Hooks, Parker Palmer, those are sacred texts for me. I'm going to pass the mic here to Keely, who we haven't heard from in a little while. If you want to talk about some of your favorite texts, and then anyone else who wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I actually just made a reference today at work to Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Maree Brown, and I think about how like these practices are so intersected with like Bell Hooks, like love ethic and all about love that she writes. And another one, I also go to like Thich Nhat Hanh for No Mud, No Lotus as well. I feel like those are just like really ground me if anyone else wants to share.
I would love to share. I was just looking at my bookshelf because it's right here, and I have a whole shelf that's like, who's like my advisors. So How We Show Up by Mia Birdsong, and Liberated to the Bone by Susan Raffo. There was one more. Oh, and The Next American Revolution by Grace Lee Boggs.
Ditto. Anyone else want to jump in with sacred text? Then we'll move on to a couple more questions.
Yeah, I love the old Black feminist, Audre Lorde. Definitely such an inspiration to me. Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, because they really centered their femininity and their love at the foundation of really powerful work that they did. So they're huge. And again, Thich Nhat Hanh, Parker Palmer, The Courage to Teach, huge inspiration. I think we have very similar bookshelves.
I'm right there with you. Definitely All About Love and a Love Ethic would be one I return to over and over again. But I also find music to be quite sacred, and film. I have a chronic illness where reading can be actually quite difficult for me. So sometimes it's grounding in other media and nature that are, I would say, like sitting by a tree is a sacred text for me. It's a sacred text right there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, there's some other questions there about the one about, would we be willing to speak to how our collective processes have built larger coalitions and more connected, inclusive community, and how and why? I mean, I'll just give a little piece of that about experimenting in different ways. I think the idea about larger, I wouldn't necessarily, sometimes I think, an inch wide, a mile deep. That the quality of deep relationship, if we're always looking at scale, is a little bit, we're influenced by the capitalistic impetus towards bigger and larger, and that building it deeper I think of my organization, Lumos Transforms, as a practice that we are practicing many of these, what does an inclusive community look like across different identities, different geographies, different disabilities. And we actually are doing some experiments in virtual community building cross geography. And so humble, humility, like leading with humility, leading with curiosity, and like the really true childlike curiosity. What would happen if, without a desire for like a trying to control an outcome, and seeing what happens when we center our values over and over and over and over again. I don't know. That's how I would say about building, my experience of building inclusive community currently.
Thanks, Nkem. Anyone else feel inspired to jump in? How the collective process builds larger coalitions and more connected, inclusive community?
Oh,
I
I can
can.
go. Oh, sorry.
Go,
Jacoby,
Keely.
you want to
You
go
go.
first?
You go,
Okay.
Keely.
Yeah, I was just gonna say with my work, I'm in a group called Transforming Justice Coalition, and we really work to center like directly impacted folks, who are impacted by the carceral state. And our explicit value is to really like reduce or like shut down like the footprint. And I think about like how a lot of people from the organization, they have different views on like the criminal justice system, and like crimes, like mandatory sentencing and stuff. And these are all like really challenging topics to have to talk about. But at the end of the day, we like really have like restorative like justice, and we talk about like we've created like a circle when there's harm. And we're really open about like our shared goals, but also at the same time, like these are like consequences that will happen if like there's a policy that's being passed. And I think about how like our organization will always center like Black, Brown, and other people of color who are really impacted. And I think about like how like people who are like white or more privileged like are intentionally like taking space back and using like their privilege to work with lawmakers. And I feel like that's just like the best way to like build trust around like the work that we're doing too. So that's just something that I'm experiencing. But yeah, go ahead, Jacoby.
Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. I was thinking about, I just led a queer and trans yoga retreat here in Utah, and just thinking about these spaces that are like, you know, somewhere from like 30 to 80 people at a time. So like not huge, but one of the primal factors of how I bring people together is creating belonging and insisting that we all belong there, and that we're not going to play the game of like who's more aware than one another or calling each other out. We're actually like calling each other in, and getting curious from the inside out. How can I foster my own sense of belonging from my heart so that any space that I go into, I feel like I belong there. While also sometimes, as Keely was pointing out, like that can mean for me as a white-bodied person, ceding space and figuring out how to shift who gets the attention. And then I think also I've had an opportunity even once through Off the Mat. Hala is the organization that Hala founded, and I've worked with a bit, to work with white folks, primarily white women. And part of the work there also, I try to do like create softness and foster joy, and kind of build a different kind of whiteness that actually supports justice rather than, you know, interferes with it. Like there's a way to be in our bodies and shift our roles and shift how we show up. And a lot of that is overcoming, for some of us in privileged positions, like overcoming shame and guilt and moving into action that's useful, as Keely was talking about.
If I might just add something on there that just I was inspired from Keely and what they said. For me in this, because I'm a professor and I have cohorts of 13 students every semester, and we do deep dives into these discussions of work on healing and justice. And it's very small impact, and it feels very small and local. But then someone like Keely, who was my student years and years ago, is now off going and building this in so many deep and powerful ways that are much grander. And as Jacoby just mentioned, Off the Mat Into the World, the organization that Hala co-founded, they would do these workshops with, you know, maybe 30 people, and then those each would go off and do stuff. And so I really do believe that there's a deep, powerful work of close relationship building and the depth of work that Nkem was talking about, and knowing and trusting that that ripple effect does then occur, and how that goes on and on is really powerful. And I know Nkem has done huge contracts with huge entities, but it's the depth of work with individuals and how they're spreading out with their power and leadership, and then those on the grassroots, all the different inside out, bottom up, top down, as Ajahn Poo says, all the different ways that we get at the work, I think are important. Oh, we have more questions than we have time for, and this is so lovely. But there was another one here if someone wants to speak quickly, and then we'll begin to wrap up, which is how can we begin to practice building spaces and events centered around community and healing without replicating oppressive systems? Hala, maybe do you want to say something to this, or Booker?
I'm happy to, but I feel like it's time to go. It's 5:30, so I want to respect.
Okay.
I will say, read the book. I mean, like, essentially, that's such a big question, and I think essentially we are talking about the personal, interpersonal, and systemic responsibilities, right? And so, the ways we don't want to replicate these systems is by really doing that deep personal and interpersonal dive and cultivating critical consciousness, so our consciousness of ourselves inside the socio-political context that we're in, to pull in Paulo Freire and some of his work around pedagogy of the oppressed, is how do we develop that critical consciousness. So I will leave it there because I know it's our time.
I just also want to point out that one of our dear beloved colleagues and collaborators in this anthology and the workbook is Claudia Vanessa Rodriguez and Reyes, and they have something in the chat to say about it as well. So I encourage people to look at their comment in the chat, and to, as Hala said, read the book, and so you get to see all the collab. We have 12 different people who participated in this book, and not all of us could be here today, but we have a lot of good, fun examples of how we answer those questions in the books.
Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful that you are all here with us tonight. I'm grateful to all of the people who are in the chat. I recognize so many names in the chat. People who are community builders in Atlanta and around our various feminist and queer and trans and racial justice communities and disability justice communities across the country. So thank you for being with us. I want to encourage you to buy Practicing Liberation, both the book, and you can pre-order the workbook now from Charis. It comes out next week. The book is available right now, so you can click this teal button to buy them both from Charis. We really do appreciate it when you buy your event books from us. It really does help us. You can also support the work of Charis Circle, our nonprofit, by making a donation at any time. I want to let you know that Charis is turning 50 this year in November, and our celebration is themed around some of these concepts that we've been talking about tonight. We are taking Octavia Butler's sort of call to take root among the stars from Parable of the Sower and really using that as our guidepost. Some of the names that were shouted out as, big thinkers are coming to Charis throughout this fall. So Adrienne Marie Brown will be with us to celebrate her new book. Alexis Pauline Gumbs will be with us to celebrate her definitive biography of Audre Lorde. So we have some really wonderful things happening, and we would love for y'all far and wide to be with us. So if you're interested, just come to Charis's homepage, check it out, and buy a ticket to our big dance party. It's the week of the election. We're going to need to party one way or another, and we'd love to party with all of y'all. So thank you once again to everyone involved in tonight's event. We are very honored to be in this work with y'all, and stay safe and well. Good night, y'all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thanks to our interpreters, Nat and Erica. We appreciate you.